Okay, so here we are. We're going to speak about mobility, and first of all, we're going to speak about static body weight stretching. So this lesson is going to bring us through why we do it, its relevance. So 2 to 3 really fundamental principles that I want you to know, the areas that we focus on, and the prescription and how we apply it. So about 20 minutes of a lecture on static body weight stretching. So first of all, it's really important that we understand that you're going to lose range in positions that habitually you don't use. And what I mean by that is if you spend a tremendous amount of time in a seated position, which we predominantly tend to do in 21st century living, whether it be driving to work, eating our dinner, sitting in front of a computer, going to bed at night, because an awful lot of us will find a fetal position when we do that as well. We spend a lot of time in flexion. And there's a trade-off with that. And the trade-off is that some muscles are going to get chronically tight, some muscles are going to get weak, and it changes the structure of our joints and our connective tissues and our function. So with that, from a performance standpoint, you can't be skillful in a position that you can't find. And a simple example could be, I could be training a 15-year-old lad. I could be asking him to find an A position against the wall for an A march. And if he hasn't got the ability to actually hold that hip inflection, to dorsiflex his ankle, to control his lumbopelvic area, to have a good tall torso because of mobility restrictions, then he's never ever going to find those positions on the field. And all the cueing in the world is pointless because he doesn't have the ability to be skillful in those positions because he doesn't have the range or the mobility to allow him find those positions. So I love this analogy here of the racing car. And I want you to think of this in terms of athletic performance. Everyone thinks about racing. Everyone looks at the final car, the final piece of the puzzle, the match day. All right, everyone is looking at the outcome. Okay, but the process to get to the outcome is really, really important. And first of all, you have to get the chassis right. And in this case, I want you to realize that flexibility is a massive component to that chassis. It's massive. If you do not get that right, then building strength, aerobic capacity, power, and all those other capacities on top of a body that is lacking in range and dexterity and stability, then you're going to, at very best, not perform that very well when you race the car, but at worst, it's going to break down. So we need to understand that this is the starting point for what we're trying to do. And if you're a beginner when it comes to like flexibility and range training, static body weight stretching is your starting point anyway, okay? So I want you to understand, right, that muscle tension is the continuous or passive partial contraction of a muscle during rest. Long static stretching allows you to decrease that resting tension in the muscle. So that is one of the major benefits of this type of stretching. The next thing is CNS recalibration. And when I say CNS, I'm talking about central nervous system. So we have two branches of our anatomic nervous system. We have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nerve. When we are training, the heart rate is elevated and we have the collision of sport. We're in this, heightened sympathetic state. Then when you consider that we all have stresses in our lives outside of training, whether it be mortgages, relationships, exams, work. So that again heightens this sympathetic response. And the ability to shift into a parasympathetic state happens during sleep, it happens during meditation, it happens during relaxation, and it also happens during, or we'll get this from long static stretching when we bring it back to our breath and we start to decrease resting tension in the muscle and relax. So think of it as a central nervous system recalibration. And with that, it allows us to increase recovery and regeneration. And the last real benefit of this type of stretching is it allows us to manipulate the apprehension reflex. Now, there are certain reflexes in our body, neural reflexes, and it's the manipulation of these reflexes that are the key to flexibility training. So these three reflexes are the apprehension reflex, reciprocal inhibition reflex, and the post-contraction inhibition reflex. Now, the reciprocal inhibition reflex and the post-contraction inhibition reflex, I'm not going to speak about now, because we're going to speak about them in more detail in future lessons. But the apprehension reflex is really important because this term refers to the projection of, or the anticipation of, the discomfort of going deeper into any stretch. So people in pain will experience this more acutely, and apprehension is the major limiter when you're talking to returning to any form or range of movement. So spending time in the position, it's simply we adapt to specific whatever we impose on the body. So it's one of the most simple and basic principles of training. Okay, so we adapt to impose demands. So if we spend time in a position, there will be an adaptation to that time that we have spent there. So what are we stretching? When you think about, the common areas that get tight with people, ankles get stiff and locked up, okay, down to inadequate footwear. Like think of your general run-of-the-mill club GAA team. You have X amount of farmers because of the nature of GAA being, a parochial, rural sport in many ways. So you'll have a farmer who may have spent 8 hours a day, 7 days a week in a Wellington. And a Wellington essentially is going to switch off any movement at his ankle because of the nature of how it forms around his foot. So therefore, we expect that athlete to then have a range or a function to find a good shin angle and good mechanics when it comes to sprinting and acceleration and change of direction. And it's not going to happen in many cases. So foot and ankle is massive here. It's massive here. Footwear is huge. Think of a lady who's in high heels all day. So she's in this state of like constant plantar flexion. Heel cords get really tight. Then we expect this person to have range through the ankle, but you're going to lose that range because of what I said at the start. Again, habitually, if you don't spend time in a position, you lose the position, okay? So here we're looking at plantar fascia stretches, that connective tissue on the sole of our foot. We're looking at tibialis stretches. We're looking at calf stretches. We're looking at hamstring stretches. And you'll notice that some of them are kneeling and some of them are half kneeling. And I'll explain why we manipulate posture later on in the presentation. Then we have quads and hip extension. Now, in my experience, it's the hip extension that catches an awful lot of people. This ability to get full range of hip extension. So when you see a lot of players who are running for periods of time and their back gets really stiff, there's a tremendous amount of those players have a real lack of hip extension, and therefore they end up with issues in other areas of the body, in particular the lower back. Then we're looking at hip capsule adductor as well. Okay, so again, massive one here is hip internal rotation. Like if you're talking about hurling and if you're lacking internal rotation when you're striking, then that is a massive range that is limiting you as a player and limiting you in terms of performance. It's really, really important. So think hip internal rotation, think your piriformis stretch, think your posterior hip capsule, and again, your adductor stretch as well. And then, of course, we have shoulders and lats. When you think of the normal player who goes to a gym, he's going to do lots of pull-ups, lots of push-ups. What do pull-ups and push-ups use? They use the lats. What's our lats? Lats are internal rotators of the shoulder. So it's really important that number one, we undo all that. And number two, we even have the range to do that in the first place. So In order to do a proper push-up, you know, it's really important that you internally rotate at that shoulder girdle, because that's what allows you to create force, same as a bench press. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at prone A, prone T, prone Y, and prone L. Okay, we're looking at strengthening like your mid traps and these muscles, which are really, really important, rhomboids and so forth. We're also looking at internal rotation of that shoulder girdle as well. So principles, all right? So the first principle I want to go through is the role of gravity in assisting you or resisting you in your stretch. So if you look at these first two positions here, the position are fundamentally, my feet are adducted, my legs are adducted, sorry, and that's a straddle position. And what I'm doing is I'm flexing at the hip. So in gymnastics, they call this a pancake position. The first one here, I'm standing on my feet. So therefore, the weight of my body or my trunk is pushing down. And you can see how it has the effects of gravity on that. So now this is assisting me in the stretch, and it's going to allow a greater force vector when I'm dropping into that stretch. Whereas if you look at the position where I'm sitting on the ground, now all of a sudden, my body position relative to gravity has completely changed. So now I'm not going to get the same force application or the same force vector. So therefore, I'm not going to be able to go as deep into this stretch because I don't have the same level of assistance. So that second position there is like your standard sit and reach test, which is just a test of segmental flexion. And you can see here that I don't have the same range as I do when I'm on my feet. And you can see how gravity, or the gravitational forces based on my body position relative to the floor, plays a big, big role in this. And the last one is, if you look at the seated wall adductor stretch, I'm just lying on my back. And you can see that as my legs adduct, that gravity, the weight of my legs plus gravitational forces is going to push my legs down towards the floor, and it's going to assist me in the stretch. And you can see again the role of gravity in the stretch. And you'll notice that how we program these things, that the relationship of our bodies and these dimensional relationships to gravity play a big role in how we stretch and how we use our available range. Okay, the next principle is body control and body positioning. So reducing postural load from the start is really important. And what you'll notice is an awful lot of people lack control through the pelvis and that lumbopelvic area. And then what happens is they lose that connection and that positioning, and they end up, number one, not finding good alignment. I mean, that's one thing when you're stretching, but when you bring that poor alignment into performance, then it can have a disastrous effect. So a simple example I have for you is, if you can think of your standard couch stretch, where someone will put one foot against the couch and the other leg out at 90 degrees from that, okay, with the knee bent. And when they add they get their trunk upright and throw their arms overhead, they dump through that lumbar spine. They find, an anterior pelvic tilt, and all of a sudden they lose the connection in that lumbopelvic area. They get this big arch to lower back. And again, that's not conducive to good positioning, because this lack of pelvic control can be detrimental in many ways when you hit the field. So to build confidence, it sometimes can be more beneficial to reduce the postural load, to regress the load slightly, like I have done in this movement here. And what that does is it just allows the person to find a position, find stretch, without having to compromise that lumbopelvic area. So if you look here, this is like a quad floor stretch. So quite similar to the adaptations and the outcome to a couch stretch, but now you can see that getting a really deep stretch through like rec fem and my quads. But even as I drop into the deeper ranges of this stretch, it's easy for me to stay connected and control my pelvis because of the postural load that I'm imposing on my body. So now all of a sudden, I don't have to worry or as much about that. And it just helps me build confidence and awareness in that position. So you'll notice that we'll do an awful lot of like single leg stretches, because that allows us to check out how symmetrical we are. It allows, now on that, nothing in nature is perfectly symmetrical. You could plant 2 trees in your front lawn tomorrow morning. You could expose them to the same environment. You could expose them to the same amount of watering, to the same soil. Everything is the same, but they're not going to grow at the same rates, and they're not going to look identical. And like, our bodies are no different. We're complex organisms. So for many reasons, in terms of how we organize our bodies and what affordances we have, we're going to favor certain things when we're performing tasks. And through the virtue of time, that will lead to certain asymmetries in our bodies. So when we do like single leg stretches or single side stretches, it exposes these and it allows us to create awareness around these, and it allows us to try to close the gap from one side to the other. Okay. So you notice in our programming that there are an awful lot of stretches, especially at this level, where you're lying prone on the ground or you're lying on your back, where we're reducing the postural load to allow you to build that mind-body connection so that you don't lose position. Okay, so the prescription. First of all, rotators are key. I've already expressed that. So internal rotators, external rotators, hips and shoulders, really, really important that we develop that rotational capacity at the joint, because especially with internal rotation, the more internal rotation you can develop, in my experience, the more flexion and extension you develop as well. You're always looking for a 2 to 3 minute work window in each position. So that will allow you time to adapt to the position and to the stretch. And it also is proven in research to be the optimal time for the cellular adaptations and the musculoskeletal adaptations down to the finer details of what we're looking to do. Attention drives intention, right? So probably the biggest struggle I have is training finishes and you have a group of players, or you have a group of clients, or you have a group of people, and we go into our stretch, and straight away people zone out and they start chatting and they start thinking about other things that are on their horizon for the day to come or for the evening to come. And it's almost like, right, the work is done now, we'll tick a box and we'll finish. But I always like to think of my stretching and my post session as being my warm-up for the next session. So it's really important that we really put our attention, our focus, and our concentration at that time, because we really want to try to maximize that little block of time we have. Connect to your breath. That's really, really important, that when we understand that we can control so much of our physiology and so much of our biology and so much of even the metaphysical through our breath. And if we can manipulate breath, we can manipulate tension, and we can manipulate the neurological response to what we're doing and inhibition and so forth. And it allows us find new positions, and it allows us to sustain new positions and maintain new positions. So when do we apply it? You can apply this stuff with standalone sessions. So you can do it on your day off, do your static bodyweight stretching for 25-minute blocks on your day off, 30-minute blocks, or you can do it post training. And the last little point here is, if you're not assessing, you're just guessing. I should have a not in there, by the way. If you're not assessing, you're just guessing. So it's really important that you take photos, put up videos, that you have some form of an objective marker in which you can assess your progress. That's really, really important. So what I like to do is I like to have 3 to 4 fundamental positions, okay? They're the fundamental positions that you will have seen and you will see in prior videos. So your standing pike and your pancake and so forth. And then you keep checking in through the medium of photo, or if a picture paints 1,000 words, then a video will paint 10,000 words. And if you video yourself for 10-15 seconds in a position, then you can look at your facial expressions, you can look at how relaxed you are in the positions. You know, a picture is highly decontextualized, whereas a video will give you a longer frame in which you can make an assessment or gauge your progress off as well. So there we have static bodyweight stretching and that lesson. So you will find your static bodyweight stretches within the context and within this coursework. Again, this is your starting point. This is where we lay the foundations or the chassis for the work to come.